Hi there, and welcome to Ektron's Developer Office Hours. Today we're going to be talking about widgets, device detection, and progressive enhancement. I have no idea how much time we're going to dedicate to any of those three topics, but we'll see where we go. And joined today by my all-star cast of developers, which is always wonderful to have, including David, who's one of our recently announced MVPs. And for anybody who's watching, if you have any questions about what we're talking about today or just anything web-related in general, feel free to reach out on Twitter using the EktronOH hashtag. And so with that, I'll let my co-hosts and cohorts introduce themselves, and starting with Dan.
Hi, Dan McGarry with Avante's Web Solutions, and I've been programming on the Ektron framework for probably about 8 years now.
And David?
My name's David. I work for Solarity, and I've been working with Ektron since version 7.0. And yeah, I'm a new MVP too, so yay.
And Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe Mayberry. I'm a web developer for WSOL and a lead Ektron partner. I've been working with Ektron since version 7.5, so 2007 or 8.
Yeah, it'll probably be about that. Actually coming up on my 8th anniversary of working with Ektron next month. So since version 6.1.3.
Wow.
That was a real gem. We've come a long way, gentlemen. We've come a long way.
Yes, we have.
So I know that that all three of you are a fair hand at writing widgets. Something that, and this is something I've been able to explain to somebody recently. Joe, you wrote a blog post a while back on using widgets just as user controls, because that's all a widget really is. Page builder widget is just a user control.
Right.
And I will share out the link to that blog post because it's definitely worth reading. But I wanted to show a widget just so we can kind of walk through the code and highlight some of the specifics that go into that. And I know this may look a little different from how you do it, Joe, in the specifics, but the idea is obviously going to be the same.
No problem. I mean, things have changed and evolved over time, and there's always multiple ways to do something. So.
Yep. So this widget, which I'm calling Ektron Text, this is actually a widget from the Ektron.com website, and it's the most simple in output of all of the widgets that I have, because the output is just sending out text, and it gives you a lot of options. So as far as the editor view goes, it's fairly complicated, but the output is just text with styles, is all it is. But the real magic happens on the code behind. Can you guys see that okay? Do I need to enlarge the text, or are we good?
No, I can see it.
Okay. So the structure, this is the structure that goes into every widget that I author. Joe, I expect you have similar. You've probably got some of the same pieces at the very least.
Yep.
So I've got a region for properties, which are all of my editor properties, all of the options that my authors are allowed to set. So it includes the text and whether they want to enable coloring, sizing, capitals, bold, etc. So a lot of just text options there. Have two declarations declared globally, the host and the page itself. So the host is the page host. It's one of the controls that you put into your page layout template, is the page host. We don't try to set this value right away, and that's part of being able to use this as a regular .NET user control, is not attempting to set that host right away. I've got a couple of APIs that I'm an API and a string value that I'm initiating in a singleton style. It's not a true singleton. But the big piece that I knew I was missing until reading some of Joe's information, some of the blog posts he wrote, was a constructor. That's one of the big things, right, Joe?
Right. Yeah, this is the thing that lets you actually run this as regular user control, passing in those values from your widget properties into the actual values of the control.
Right.
And have the defaults.
Yep. So in mine, I'm not trying to pass the values from the properties. I'm just setting them to the same defaults. And if somebody wants to override those when they place the control, they can do that. We have 2 page events. The page init, and this is where we do try. So we put this into a try because this is going to fail. This line is going to fail if this is outside of the page builder context. Trying to get the host is actually going to throw an error. So I do wrap that in a try catch. I'm not doing anything with the error because it's an expected error. It's one that, when I use that as a user control, just letting that get swallowed up. And then if the host is actually there, if we're successful in getting it, then we set the page value and some of the host properties, such as the edit, maximize, minimize, and create event handlers, which are just delegates. And then finally, the init does set the active view to the visitor output view. Right, and then Joe, do you use? I assume you do. Do you use pre-render for all of your output magic?
It goes back and forth. A lot of times I'll use pre-render or page load, just depending on the mood I'm in for the day.
Okay. I use pre-render, and this is just creating all of that customization on the text. It does the output to the literal control, and then all of the classes and styles that are a result of the selection made by the author are applied to a div that contains that literal control. So I only do that if there is text. So if there's not text, then it doesn't display anything. It's just an empty widget on the page. But if there's not text and you're in an editing mode, which I can do with that page variable that we set in the what was it, init? Yeah, init. And set the output text to a helper message, just instructing the author. But the author is the only one who's going to see this because it's only going to be displayed when the page is in editing mode. Right, and then we have the widget events themselves. So the edit event, where you're taking all of the properties of the user control and assigning them to those the form controls from .NET. And I do put the required field validators and regular expression validators on my .NET form controls as well, where appropriate. And you'll see that the Save button does try to validate a custom validation group. Each of my widgets has a different validation group. It's just the name of the widget. So if the page is valid, take all of those values from the form, save them back, and then set the view back to the output. And of course, cancel just sets the output view. Right, and the last thing I have is a helper method that sets JavaScript. You can see I've got some of it commented out here because there is no output JavaScript. There is JavaScript for the author view. And so this is another situation where I'm only going to register this JavaScript and this CSS when the active view is the edit view. So I'm not unnecessarily loading my authoring CSS and JavaScript into the page if it's just a site visitor. So I have my own JavaScript, CSS. Do you guys combine your JavaScript into like one file? Do you put it into your like main site JavaScript file, or and CSS file, or do you keep them separate for each widget?
I keep them separate for each widget. I actually have a package that I use per widget. I actually have a package base now that I designed, and each one has a behavior.js and then a main or a widget CSS file.
Okay.
And I just register them using the framework.
Yeah, which is what I'm doing, and that does your aggregation and minification and caching. So Dan, do you do separate or combined JS
No,
and CSS?
I do separate for each. I basically follow pretty much what David does. I like to, one of the first things that I like to do is create a dedicated subfolder within the widget directory for any associated files, and I'll put my one-off JS file in there.
Right. And Joe, what about you?
I'm actually the oddball here. We actually have some standard JavaScript files and CSS files that we combine, and we really don't set a whole lot in the widget properties themselves like this. We've got some other methodologies to aggregate and minify all those files together.
Okay.
So
I know that.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, for us, it tends to keep the user controls a little bit, especially the widget folders cleaner, a lot less files that it has to handle, and it keeps it a little more organized for us.
Yeah, I know that there are a lot of different philosophies around it. I don't think that any one is necessarily hands above the other. As long as you're internally consistent, I think that's the most important thing. There's no reason that you would have to keep JavaScript and CSS and other resource files for your widget inside a folder, inside the widgets folder. That was just the standard that Ektron started with, and a lot of people have followed that, but you certainly don't have to. If you want to keep all of your JavaScript files in another location and have your own solution, then by all means go with that.
Initially it wasn't that big of a deal, but with all those RESX files in there now for the various languages, it does start to get cluttered. So I actually I like keeping it. I tend to put like objects together. So for me, it's almost an organizational thing.
Yeah, and I would agree with that just for myself, because I do look at widgets as being something that, because I do share a lot of them, I want to be able to just grab them as a package and be able to zip them up really quickly. So if it's all of the JavaScript is all put into the same file or something like that, it just makes things a lot more difficult to do.
It does. It does. The thing that I started finding was that, especially with JavaScript files, if we broke them out for each individual widget, there's a lot of duplication, and so we were seeing a lot of things that had the same files and same structure in them. So we started combining those.
Yeah, I could probably look at something like require.js to take care of that as well. So Joe, I think you should force that on Brad. Tell him he needs to learn require.js.
Yeah, because that always works.
It can be done. It can be done. He is starting. He is starting to give up XSLT, and it's been a work in progress for a couple of years now.
We've definitely moving away from it. He's actually, we're looking at a lot more MVC and stuff like that. So yeah. We're coming into the 21st century.
Welcome aboard. Something else I do not actually put any JavaScript in the markup of the page. I do see people do this quite a bit. They put the jQuery document ready or something like that inside the markup of the widget. I don't like that for a number of reasons, but the main one is that when you're editing the page, you don't see that JavaScript in action if you do a document.ready inside the widget markup, because it's being updated via Ajax, because it's in an update panel. It's not going to trigger that document ready. It's because the browser isn't loading a new document at that point. So I don't like doing that. I do like keeping the JavaScript separate, both for reuse and it's kind of like looking at, there's a reason you can do separate JavaScript files, just like there's a reason you can do separate CSS files. It's separating those concerns out. So just see that as a best practice, and I do have separate editing and output JavaScript files as well as separate editing and output CSS for each of my widgets. And so what I do here is I create an object that's been namespaced to a certain degree with an init function, and inside the init function, I put my logic. Some of these contain other functions like set row colors, but I do try to keep all of that separate, and then use the API registered JavaScript block method to trigger that init, which seems to work a lot better than putting any kind of script inside the markup. So you guys do something similar to that?
Yeah, I actually take more of a plugin approach, like jQuery plugins when I register and initialize my stuff. So
Yeah.
I use closures and do it very much as though it were its own standalone jQuery plugin. And then, for the rest of it, I pass the settings along just like you're doing. The JavaScript register and CSS register that you call, I actually have, like, you have the edit UI and edit UI CSS files. I create just a base package, and I actually use my library that I kind of wrote based off of the Ektron stuff, so that I can pass in a relative path based off of the widget that I've got. So most of that is not really included, but it's the same kind of concept.
Right. Yeah, I know you wrote your own JavaScript and CSS loader that allows you to place the JavaScript and CSS. So is that what you're referring to? The one that's shared on the Dev Center?
Yep. Yeah. That plus it allows you to. I added a couple extra functions to it to allow you to supply relative paths differently, so that you can create your packages a little more flexible than what is currently available.
Okay. So we'll share that link out as well if any of you want to, like Joe, if you want to try to find your blog post and share that out. And
yeah, I've actually did share it out. So.
Okay, great.
He's got that set to a macro key in Twitter.
Yeah, let me retweet that. So no questions so far. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So anybody who's joined since we first came on, if you have questions, tweet them out using the EktronOH hashtag. We will watch for those and answer them as we can. But this, what I'm showing right now is, I think it's great. I do all of my widgets like this because I love the flexibility of having the ability to use that as just a standard user control. That's actually extremely helpful for testing your widget as well, as you don't have to drag it into a page builder page. You can just drag it into a template, set your properties by hand, and try to load that template. So if you need to debug your widget, it works a lot better this way.
Yeah, it gives you a lot more flexibility. So one thing that I've started doing is the server cache widget that I know used to be out on the old dev site. I'm not sure if it still is.
It's on the new one. I moved it over there specifically.
But I will quite often when I'm working on a client side, I'll create a page that's just loading up that widget, so I don't have to keep going to the work area to clear out cache and stuff like that on the servers. So.
Yeah, that's great. All right, so that is just a quick run through of a widget. Anybody has questions, let us know. I did want to talk a little bit about device detection and progressive enhancement. David, I know this is something that you and I could probably spend days discussing if we had that kind of time and enough to drink, right?
Yeah, we actually did get a question from J. Gary Thompson about the weight of page builder pages, especially for mobile. So he's asking what our opinions are. So
Page Builder will add a bit of HTML markup compared to not using Page Builder. So it's a balancing act of sorts. I don't consider the weight that it adds to be very critical because it's not that much. It's just text markup, and it's not like you're suddenly going from a half megabyte page to a 3/4 megabyte page or something like that. It's something that compresses, especially if you've got like gzip enabled or something like that. You're not going to notice it very much. But if you don't do your JavaScript correctly, if you don't do your CSS correctly, which is something like what we were doing, which is registering those in an API or a tool that will minify, aggregate those into a single download, and cache them. If you're not doing that, then you're going to have more weight problems because you're not just increasing the size of the request, you're increasing the number of requests if you're not doing that. So it's a combination of those two things that you have to watch out for, not just the size by itself, the size of the markup by itself. So I hope that helps, Gary. All right, so device detection. I was reading an article today because I was actually going to start playing around with writing widgets that had device detection in them. And turns out we're not going to be able to do that very reliably from this point forward, especially with Internet Explorer. Have you guys found that to be true?
Haven't yet. You know, found a lot of things, especially with the browser starting to go in with no user agent switcher, stuff like that. I know it makes it very helpful testing things, trying to test out whether you're on a mobile device or not, but I haven't seen a problem with it yet.
Well, apparently this is primarily coming out of Internet Explorer and what Microsoft's been doing with their Surface tablets, which is not much of a shock, really, that problems come out of Internet Explorer and things that Microsoft does. But the user agent itself is becoming less reliable a method of determining whether a device is even mobile or not. Mm-hmm. So apparently on Internet Explorer 10, on one of the surfaces that have come out in the last couple of years, the user agents between the Metro view and the desktop view are identical. They're not just similar, they're identical. And I think that we're probably going to see this trend continuing with other browsers as well, that because there's so much bleed over between device classes, because you can have desktops that are touch screens, and you can pair keyboards to your mobile phones and your tablets. I think you're probably going to see less and less, just based on the user agent, of being able to tell the differences between those devices.
Well, you bring in some good points, and it goes beyond that. Really, because our mobile devices are becoming so much more powerful that they're transcending just being a mobile device. I mean, with the Surface tablets, I've got one. I love it. But I can hook it up to a large display, and mount a keyboard onto it and all that, and I've got a working computer, not a mobile device. I can do similar things with my with my cell phone, my smartphones. I can have large devices. I've got they're hooked into my Wi-Fi, so I don't have network issues. I'm not over a slow connection. Those things then make it so it's not necessarily a mobile device anymore in that context.
Right. So yeah, I think everything really comes down to the size of the device when you're making those kinds of decisions, rather than the device class itself. But there's not really a reliable server-side way of getting those sizes of devices. There are some libraries like Wurfel, and there's another one that try to keep up, but the rate devices come out, it's kind of a losing battle is the way I see it. You constantly have to update those libraries. So is it worthwhile? I think that the answer really is to go with progressive enhancement more than even relying on any kind of device detection. With progressive enhancement, you could actually send detected attributes and feature capabilities back to the server and then let the server make decisions for that session. But I don't think that you can really make a lot of decisions just with server-side information now.
Yeah, I think one of the things we really need is a way to detect the type of network or the type of use of the object. You start getting into a really kind of gray area, because while I agree with the progressive enhancement and the responsive design, and part of our constant back and forth is this point. When you're on a mobile network now, with a lot of these new plans going to set data limits and requirements for things, and you've got, sure, there's plethora of devices like the Surface or these other tablets that are now fully capable of doing what tasks that you would normally relegate to a laptop. It's still useful to be able to cut back on the amount of data or the amount of information you're sending forward to those devices when they're on mobile networks, for instance, or for just speedy purposes in some cases, so that you're not only giving a progressive enhancement or responsive design, but you're also limiting the amount of data that the item has to process in order to do that display or create the functionality. It's totally different to look on a laptop or a Surface when you're at home and plugged into your Wi-Fi and downloading the stuff than it is to maybe have it on the go and be in the car connected to a 3G or 4G hotspot and needing to look up a hotel or something right then and there. So I think that's a gray area. I mean, there's not a really good solution yet to that, but that's kind of one of the sacrifices we as developers have to kind of decide on.
So what do you think about say figuring out what minimal information would be for your page or for your site, and just sending that through the original markup? The initial request is, let's say, minimal information is just navigation and the actual content.
Mm-hmm.
No other things, right? Just no ads, no CTAs, no footer, right? Except for maybe some contact information in the footer or something like that. But then you let JavaScript asynchronously load the other bits, rather than saying we're going to try to send everything all at once. So that way you are able to use JavaScript to say this does support touchscreen or not, or this does support geolocation or not, and then allow the server to make decisions. So one of the things that JavaScript could send back is, this is the width and height of the viewport.
Yep. Yeah, lazy loading with client-side feature detection. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great approach, and one that's finally starting to be used. But I think that's definitely one way to counter that problem, because you get all the data you need right away, and anything that doesn't actually support JavaScript, or maybe they don't want to wait for it to execute and actually make the round-robin call, if you will, to actually get the data back. You've already got it all right up ahead in front of you. I think that's a great alternative.
So
Yeah,
one of the go ahead, Joe.
Basically, I'm talking about that as a mobile-first approach, where you're designing for the smallest, least capable devices, and then adding onto it as the device can handle it.
It definitely would be mobile first, but I think it's also just content first.
Yeah.
Is another way of looking at that, is you're just loading what is necessary for the visitor. So if you're loading a blog, you load navigation, you load the blog, you don't load anything else with the initial request. So your time to first byte should go way down because of that. And if you start loading other things asynchronously, they're actually going to be able to interact with the page while those other pieces are loading.
Mm-hmm.
It also is not just a mobile first, but when you think of it from that perspective, it becomes more friendly for area needs. What is it? What is the word I'm looking for? Like screen readers and
it's accessible.
Accessibility. Thank you.
Yeah.
For accessibility purposes, because a lot of those cases they don't actually support JavaScript, or you don't want to have to worry about JavaScript. So if you develop the content first approach like that, people who have accessibility needs get the content and data that they need right there, without all the overhead that somebody else who wants the full experience would get.
Well, another use case is that there really is a digital divide. Like, that's a real thing. There are people who only have their smartphones for access to the internet, and sometimes their connections are extremely spotty. So what if they get the initial download, but then the network cuts out and they don't load all of the other bits, right? That's another piece to thinking in terms of content first, or progressive enhancement, however you want to put that, is even if you don't get the CSS, you don't get the JavaScript, if those bits fail to load for whatever reason, the user is still able to get the information that they need.
Absolutely.
So,
almost,
yeah, go ahead, Dan.
I was going to say, James, it's almost like you're advocating an abdication of of templates, as it were. Like a website could simply just become a single file that downloads, that does a JSON call back and then defines itself to the browser depending on the device that it's on, and taking David's point into consideration, all the other small little, what is the capacity of the device and what is its current capacity at this particular moment, and giving just enough to to create that toehold, and then expanding further. Another thing too, I've kind of got stuck into Assassin's Creed lately, so I apologize, but it had me thinking about gaming consoles. Quite frankly, they're becoming very visually rich, and depending on the size of the monitor that's hooked up, there could be multitudes of information that could come down to a device, and thinking about desktop versus mobile I think that divide is really behind us. It's simply content first, and then go from there, and just creating enough of a toehold to begin that callback to the server to then pull down the information and define the page at that point in time.
You define, I would say you define a lot of what goes into the page. Some of it may be layout related, but you're not going to use JavaScript and JSON to load the body of the content itself.
Right. Okay.
You still want that to come just straight from the server on the initial request, because they may not have JavaScript. For those people who choose to disable JavaScript or don't have a browser that supports it, or if the JavaScript fails to load.
Understood.
Yeah.
I guess we'll never get away from that.
Well, I think for the most part, you're safe assuming JavaScript's there.
Yeah.
But do you want to depend on that assumption, or any assumption like that? I think is the real question.
Well, whenever I'm assuming anything in code, I always it gives me pause. Let me put it that way.
Yeah. So I do want to get to a comment from Gary. We use the same site for all devices, but use res for appropriate image delivery. And that's actually, I think that's going to continue to be the most appropriate use for res. Is something along those lines. I think what we're talking about right here is taking that idea that Gary, you're currently using for images and applying it to the entire page. That you might be pulling down layout information and things like that. In a similar fashion, you're sending data to the server about the capabilities of the browser, and allowing the server to then return different results based on what those capabilities are, what those features are. So it's taking that to the next level, not just doing screen size for images, but screen size and feature detection for what you load next in general. See, I think even what you're doing, if it's similar to what Ektron has built in, or if it is what Ektron has built in, then it's still relying on JavaScript to pull in those images. It does have a fallback to the default image, but it's relying on JavaScript to go tell the server which image is going to be the best for the current device, or the current viewport width, I should say. Because I want to get away from using device-centric language. I'm trying to force myself to get away from that, because when we're talking about tablets and phones and desktops, there's just too much crossover. Those lines are too blurry.
And referring to mobile?
Yeah. What's mobile mean?
My laptops are all mobile.
Exactly. Yeah, sometimes I'm on my laptop in an airport. Am I mobile then? Is that mobile?
I mean, to Joe's point, he's got a Surface tablet. That's basically a laptop with a detachable screen. And there's so many now with Windows 8 hybrid laptops out there that, I mean, it's a perfect example of your blurred lines for mobile, because you pop the screen off, now you're on a tablet. You pop the screen in, now you're on a laptop. Which experience do you want?
When you also have 12-inch tablets and you have 11-inch laptops.
Exactly.
You can't just base it on the size of the device.
Or netbooks back in their brief heyday.
Yeah. I still have one of those, but it's not in use.
There's a great picture that floats around every once in a while of a picture in Starbucks where a guy has brought in a 27-inch iMac set up there.
There's your mobile user.
That's right. Yeah, it's mobile. He was able to move it. So by definition.
How about the old iMacs where it was just a big tube screen with a handle on top?
They were very colorful.
Yeah.
Okay.
And mobile.
Yeah. My desktop could become mobile depending on how frustrated I get.
That's a different experience, though.
True.
All right, guys, we are 6 minutes over, but it's always fun, and most of our audience has stayed with us for the 6 minutes as well, which is even better. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. So with that, we'll sign off. We'll continue this or another conversation later. If anybody has questions after this, between now and the next office hours or whenever, feel free to tweet out on the Ektron OH hashtag. We do watch that in between episodes, so just let us know if you have any questions. We'll take them as we can. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching.